So, some common features of personality disorders include a distortion of one's self-concept. So in other words, these people see themselves in fairly different ways than the rest of the world views them. And these folks will sometimes lack stability and consistency in their self-concept. So most of us think about ourselves in a fairly consistent way from day to day. We have pretty stable moods, stable goals. We're, like all of you share this goal that I've mentioned before of working toward getting your bachelor's degree. Right? But sometimes people with these disorders will just be changing their interests pretty rapidly, and when that happens to an extreme degree, it can be kind of maladaptive because then they don't get anything accomplished. Right? So, as I've already mentioned a couple of times, impaired social relations can be another common feature. So, this can also take the form of having too much intimacy. So, there are certain personality disorders in which people get really clingy, and then others that I mentioned in which they don't seem to crave any intimacy at all. Or they might have very low levels of empathy. So this is going to be an extreme version of other types of traits that we've talked about before, like Machiavellianism and psychoticism. So another key thing that makes these personality disorders, rather than just your average psychological disorder, is that the problematic behavior that is really going to be the thing that is of interest to the therapist is pretty constant across time and across situations. So it isn't just that the person has 1 month in which they're feeling really angry. There's a really long life history. And a lot of times these problems will go all the way back to adolescence or even childhood in some cases. So when assessing a personality disorder, it's important for the therapist to talk to the person about their childhood, just like you often see with some of the more Freudian approaches to therapy. So talk about their adolescent life. Occasionally, they might try talking to the person's parents as well, just because a lot of times we don't have the clearest memories of what we were like during childhood. Okay. So, finally, it's important to note that these personality disorders are internal to the individual. So they're not caused by things like drugs or other medical conditions. So if someone starts taking some type of psychoactive drug, like methamphetamine, and you see a big change in their behavior and their personality, well, that isn't a personality disorder, that's a substance abuse disorder. Likewise, if someone suffers an injury, and like a brain injury, such as the Phineas Gage example that we've talked about before, and you see a rapid change in their personality as a result of that, that's still not considered a personality disorder because of the fact that it resulted from that injury. It's a medical condition rather than a psychological, strictly psychological condition. Okay. So, questions about that? Okay, so there are a couple of different ways that you can think about or conceptualize disorders. And so we'll begin with the categorical view. So this is a more traditional perspective on disorders that suggests that a person either has a disorder or they don't. So, in other words, comparing someone with a psychological disorder to someone who is psychologically healthy is like comparing apples to oranges. So, the disorder is viewed as being qualitatively different from the normal traits. So there's something present in people with a psychological disorder that is not present in people who are psychologically healthy. So, tying this back into the name, this would suggest that people who have disorders would fit into a different category from people who are psychologically healthy. So that's, again, that's one way of thinking about disorders. Another way is the dimensional view, and you might recognize these terms from the perspectives on emotion that we talked about before. It's kind of a similar way of thinking. So the dimensional view suggests that we should view psychological disorders on a continuum, kind of like I was talking about earlier. So, this suggests that disorders are just extreme levels of normal traits. And so most people are going to, if you have the distribution within the population here, most people are going to fall in this middle range, statistically speaking. And then when you have people with a really high level of some trait or a really low level of some trait, then that's when you start to see their behavior get to this extreme point at which it would be labeled as disordered. So rather than comparing apples to oranges, this would be like comparing apples to apples of other sizes. So you have really ginormous apples that are abnormally large, or little teeny apples. But they're all apples, just like going back to personality. They're all personality traits, they're just different levels of those traits. Okay, so any questions about this? All right. So finally, it's important to take the context in which a behavior occurs into account. So when the therapist is trying to diagnose a disorder or determine whether or not someone has a disorder, they have to think about certain factors like culture, age, and gender. So as I mentioned, there are certain disorders that are more likely to occur in men than women, more likely to occur at different ages. You're not going to have teenagers with Alzheimer's, most likely. And as we talked about very recently, there are some different cultural norms. So if you have someone who grew up in one of those Asian cultures that has a more collectivist orientation, and then that person comes over and moves to New York City, they might have some problems adjusting because of the differences in culture. So their situation would be diagnosed differently than someone who grew up in that New York City type of environment and was experiencing some problems. Another kind of more extreme example would be, let's say you have certain behaviors that are normal for one culture that aren't normal for another. Like if you're looking at hunter-gatherer societies like the Hadza in Tanzania, my favorite tribe, then carrying weapons around is just a part of daily life. But if you have someone who's doing that in a metropolitan area in the United States, then that's probably going to be considered to be abnormal. You don't have a lot of people walking around with giant bows and arrows. Okay, so any questions about this stuff so far? All right, so What we're going to do for the last part of class today is just talk about the different clusters of personality disorders, and then we'll go into a great amount of detail on all the different disorders on Wednesday. Right? So we'll probably end a little bit early today. So there are, like I said, 10 disorders as defined by the DSM-4. And they fall into these three clusters. So there's the erratic cluster of disorders, the eccentric cluster, and the anxious cluster. And as I mentioned, we'll talk about the exact breakdown of all the disorders within each category on Wednesday. Right now, I just want to give you a general overview of what each cluster is like. So we'll begin with the erratic cluster. So these folks tend to, as you might expect from the name, they tend to appear very erratic and unstable. They might have a lot of difficulty controlling their emotions and getting along with other people. So they might spontaneously start crying, for example. Or they might experience unusual amounts of anger. So we'll talk about antisocial personality disorder. That's a big one that is pretty common in the criminal population. Although not everyone with antisocial personality disorder commits criminal acts. And let's see, then we have the eccentric cluster. And so there are actually some famous artists from the 20th century that were either diagnosed with these eccentric cluster disorders or are believed to have had them. So like Vincent van Gogh and Salvador Dali. And supposedly this kind of shows up in some of their work and their unusual behavior from day to day. So these people would probably be described by your average passerby as weird people. So they'll wear clothes that are very unusual. They don't really fit in at all. They might say unusual things if you try to engage them in conversation. And so most others feel pretty uncomfortable when interacting with these folks just because they don't really know what they should expect from that person. They don't know what they're going to say next. So finally, we have the anxious cluster of disorders. And this is going to be most similar to some of the common anxiety disorders. So these folks appear very anxious and fearful most of the time. And they'll often try to avoid situations that cause them to experience a lot of anxiety. We can see that common thread of problems with social interactions popping up here, because rather than just putting other people off through fluctuations in emotion, like we saw in the erratic cluster, or by just odd behavior, like we saw in the eccentric cluster, a lot of times these people will just avoid social interaction altogether. So, any questions about these clusters? All right, well, we're done pretty early for today, so I'll see you on Wednesday. And